voters, they care about affordability now more than ever.
Others are suggesting, or at least questioning, why the government is getting into the business of home ownership in the first place.
On the supply side, it is unfortunately quite a long time.
By the 17th of May 2025, Australia will have taken to the polls and voted in the federal election. But I think it's safe to say that housing is going to be a key issue. Here with me to chat about what we can expect is property journalist Benn Dorrington from REA Group and the Executive Manager of Economics at REA Group, Angus Moore. Thank you both so much for joining me. Look, it's probably safe to assume that all parties will be focused on the state of the housing market in one way or another. Angus, what do you think are going to be the main property issues that the pollies are going to be campaigning on?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that housing is going to be a pretty key issue coming into this election. And the reason for that is just the state of housing affordability broadly at the moment. To kind of put it in perspective, both buy affordability, so to buy a house, housing affordability is at its worst level we've seen on our records, which go back to 1995. And rental affordability, so how expensive is it to rent relative to your incomes, is on its worst level on our records, which go back to a little bit less, but 2008. So it's a very challenging environment for housing at the moment. Mm-hmm. And, I think clearly that's going to be affecting a lot of voters and going to be pretty top of mind.
Affordability, one, and probably the other, supply.
Exactly right. The kind of fundamental solution to affordability, and it's not going to help us this year, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, is building more homes. And we are seeing that from governments. There is a focus on that at the moment, but it is going to be a key issue.
So I think if we tackle affordability first, Angus, can you actually take us through how it's looking around the country, both buy and rent?
The way we like to measure affordability at REA Group is funnily enough, our affordability index. The way that we measure affordability is looking at, say, a typical income household and what share of homes could they afford to buy on that income. At the moment, a typical income household, so that's about $114,000, $115,000 a year. They can afford just 14% of homes that were sold in the past year. That's the lowest we've seen on our records. That's incredibly challenging.
Major.
I think it really highlights just how hard it is for many households to buy at the moment. And that's not restricted to just one part of the country. We're seeing that pretty much everywhere at the moment. There are some small exceptions. WA is a little bit better than other states, but we're really kind of splitting hairs. And across pretty much all of Australia, those numbers are pretty similar. New South Wales is a little bit worse, Tassie's a little bit worse, South Australia, Queensland a little bit better, but it is just very challenging right around the country.
If that 14% is now in 2024-5, what percentage of homes could that median income household buy in 2022?
It's changed a lot. And there's two reasons why it's changed since then. The first and biggest reason is that interest rates have shot up since then. 2022, the last election in May, the RBA had just made their first move. It was kind of clear that we were going to get a few interest rate hikes. But, if you go back a few months earlier, maybe say 6 months earlier, end of 2021, you could find a mortgage rate under 2%. Today, the average mortgage rate is 6.2%. So it's shot up. And that is the big driver of why affordability has gotten so much worse since the last election. Home prices are also part of the story, though that mostly happened in 2021 when we saw a big kick up in home prices. It's still happening in some other parts of the country. Perth is still seeing really strong growth, Adelaide, Brisbane to a little bit less of extent. So it's not just interest rates, but that is a really big change since the last election.
In the last kind of 3 to 4 years, we've seen just dramatic increases nationwide in terms of rental prices. What are things looking like in this moment?
The last few years have seen enormous increases in rents. To kind of, put it in some perspective, the kind of numbers we're talking about, since the start of the pandemic, so March 2020, rents in Sydney are up 46%. In Melbourne, they're up 34%. In Brisbane, it's 58%. Adelaide, 57%. Is this just
in the last couple of years?
Since March 2020.
58% in 5 years.
58% in about 5 years. The next one will blow your mind then. Perth, 80% in 5 years. That's obviously made rentals much less affordable than they used to be.
I don't know how people do afford that.
Rental affordability is at its worst level we've seen on our records. For a typical income household, so similar to what we're talking about with buy, a typical income household can afford 39% of rentals across Australia at the moment. To put that in perspective, in 2020, 2021, so we do this on financial years, so prior to the last election, it was 60%. So about 2/3 fewer. It's much more challenging than it used to be. That's been one of the big changes since the last federal election. That rental affordability picture's changed a lot. Affordability was getting tough in some of the smaller capitals. Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, regional areas, they were seeing pretty strong rent growth in 2021 prior to the last election. But for Sydney and Melbourne, that really wasn't the case. Rental markets were pretty soft in 2021. It wasn't until kind of 2022 and then 2023 that we really saw those two largest rental markets, which, do account for 2 in 5 rentals across Australia, really start to take off and affordability really start to worsen.
I think after hearing all of this, it's really clear that voters they care about affordability now more than ever. People are really up against it, really struggling. Ben, can you take us through some of the party election commitments to tackle affordability? I know the Coalition are proposing some sort of super scheme.
The Coalition is taking the super for housing policy to the next election. And basically that looks at allowing Australians to access either, up to 40% or as much as $50,000 from their own super to help them buy their first home. One of the big conditions with that is that money will need to be repaid once they actually sell that house in the future. But then looking at what Labor's offering, they've just passed their Help to Buy scheme last year. And that's a shared equity scheme where the government gives an equity contribution worth up to about 40% of the property's value to home buyers to help them get into the property market. And, that plan was passed just last year. They haven't had much time to implement it. They're planning to help around 40,000 home buyers with that scheme. Those home buyers will also have to pay back that money when they sell their home.
Okay, so how are these being received by the public? How they're being spoken about in the media? Is there any backlash?
There's been a lot of discussion about the pros and cons of both plans from the major parties. Starting with super for housing, supporters say that it allows Australians to use their own savings to get into the property market and, importantly, avoid retiring without a home. And that can be really costly if you're a pensioner and you're having to rent. That's a really tough situation.
Or you want to retire and you're still paying off a mortgage.
Absolutely. But then critics suggest that if you allow Australians to take money out of their super before retirement, that's going to impact their ability to save for retirement, and that might cost them in other ways. And then you've got Help to Buy. And then supporters of Help to Buy suggest again that it's helping Australians get into the market sooner. It really focuses on targeting Australians who have struggled for a home deposit. And that's really important in light of, rising home prices that we've seen in recent years, as well as the rising cost of living. But again, there are critics to this, and they're suggesting that, it's going to cost the government billions of dollars to implement this. And then others are suggesting, or at least questioning, why the government is getting into the business of home ownership in the first place. One other point I think that's kind of interesting is, the major parties both dislike each other's ideas a lot. But one thing they both really agree on, which is kind of nice to think about, is a scheme called the Home Guarantee Scheme. And this scheme basically helps home buyers avoid paying lenders' mortgage insurance. It was introduced by the previous coalition government. It's been expanded by the current Labor government. And it's just interesting that both sides of government really like this one.
Okay, well, I know the Greens are keen to kind of freeze and cap rent increases to provide immediate relief to renters. Is this idea, gaining traction in media? How's it being discussed? Because I imagine that renters versus investors and their point of view is significantly different.
Absolutely. Renters clearly love this idea. But I think one thing to consider is that, most people are aware that the rental rules are set by state and territory governments rather than the federal government, which is, what's going to the next election. So I guess it can be popular with renters, but it's something that the federal government doesn't actually have much control over in the scheme of things. One thing that is worth pointing out around rent and rental assistance is the federal government has increased the Commonwealth rent assistance during its time in office. That goes to people living on government payments. The government says it's increased the maximum rate of rent assistance by about 45% since coming to office. And so that's probably one of the few things it can control outside of supply.
There's a fair bit happening there in terms of affordability, as in what it looks like and what each party is proposing and how to tackle that. But one way to, tackle affordability is obviously supply. Now, Angus, supply looks terrible at the moment. Can you give us any insight into how things are looking around the country?
It's pretty challenging at the moment. The building sector's been fairly tough for going on 4 or 5 years at this point.
Yeah,
and so we've
majorly
just
challenged market.
Yeah, and you can see that in the rapid increase in the cost of building homes. It's been growing really quickly. The other thing that I've been following a lot, and which is maybe underappreciated, is it's taking a lot longer to build homes than it used to. Even building a detached house, used to take near as, makes no difference on average, 6 months. And today it's taking closer to 9, which doesn't sound like a huge increase, 3 months. That increase is 50% and means that we're something like 30,000 houses fewer behind in terms of in the pipeline that haven't been built than we would otherwise be. It is a big change. And it's something that didn't used to change very much. If you look at the history of this kind of series and as long as the ABS has been tracking it, it basically didn't change for the decade leading up to the pandemic. It pretty much always took us 6 months, give or take, to build a house. And now it's not. It's taking a lot longer. It's not just houses either. That's happening for apartments. It's happening for townhouses. So there are a lot of difficulties with building homes at the moment. Where that leaves us, at the moment, we're building something like about 175,000 new homes a year, which maybe sounds like a lot in isolation. But in the late 2010s, so winding back a bit over 5 years ago, we were building more like 215 to 220,000 a year. So we're actually going slower than we used to. And the target that we've got from National Cabinet, so that's the federal government and state governments together, the announced target there was 1.2 million over 5 years, which equates to 240,000 a year. So we're well behind that pace at the moment.
What number of new homes do we need right in this very moment to A, meet demand as it stands, and B, support future economic growth, which I obviously know is going to be really hard to predict because that relies on the level of immigration. Can you provide any insight into that?
Never ask an economist a direct question because we'll always avoid actually giving you an answer. And the short answer is I don't know, but a lot more than we're building at the moment.
Yeah.
It's famously very hard to actually measure how many homes we need for the sort of reasons that economists get really excited about and everyone else's eyes glaze over. The more homes we build, the cheaper they are. People will choose different housing arrangements. You might move out from living with your parents sooner. And so that means we actually need more homes. That happens because they're cheaper. So it's it all a bit circular, and that's why it's hard to put a number on it. What I can tell you is we need more than we currently have and building more than we currently are. And the reason I can tell you that quite confidently is affordability is incredibly bad at the moment. And that is kind of all we need to know that we're not building enough homes.
So Ben, what is each party proposing to tackle the supply issue? Because I know the Greens are proposing to create a public property developer to build 360,000 good quality public homes over the next 5 years. What is the sentiment around something like that?
Well, let's start with the Greens. So with this public property developer idea, to be honest, there hasn't been much said about it in the media. And that's because it's a big idea, but it would cost a huge amount of money to actually implement. The parliamentary
Taxpayers' money.
Yes, absolutely. And the Parliamentary Budget Office did some really rough costing analysis. They're very open about the fact that this is very much on the back of an envelope kind of estimates, but they've said it could cost as much as $40 billion over the decade, which is a huge amount of money. So it's one of those things that I think would be nice, but I don't know if the major parties in Canberra are really taking that idea seriously. What the parties are doing, what those major parties are doing then. For the Labor government, they have invested billions of dollars into housing supply and how to improve housing supply over their term. Their main policy has been the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, or the HAF. It got passed in, I think, last year. It plans to invest money to build about 30,000 affordable homes over the next 5 years, or within 5 years, sorry. It's also introduced a bunch of other initiatives targeted at supercharging the home building industry. There's things like the Social Housing Accelerator and the Housing Infrastructure Facility, just to name a few. But there's a lot going on in this space. Again, it's going to take years to see these initiatives deliver anything, so it's hard to say how effective they're going to be. Talking to the coalition, what the coalition is taking to the next election, one of their big ideas is investing about $5 billion to fund essential infrastructure services such as, water and power and sewerage connections at housing development sites. That's really important, to get a lot of these new homes built in the first place, or at least get that land ready for development. Just to make an observation, the current government is already doing this, but just hasn't committed as much money as the coalition. Some other smaller changes include freezing any further changes to the National Construction Code for the next 10 years in a way to sort of reduce future red tape for home builders. One thing that I think is interesting about the coalition's approach to housing supply, though, is its focus on reducing permanent migration. And this is something they connect their housing policies with migration. Their big focus is on reducing permanent migration, from 185,000 to 140,000 in the first 2 years. They're betting big on this because they think it'll take the pressure off the housing market for some time.
Angus, we've previously spoken about how local, state and federal governments need to work together to create significant change in supply. Do you think that the federal election can actually have a big impact on moving this dial in terms of getting the other governments to kind of pull their finger out and maybe do something?
It's actually quite hard for the federal government to have much impact directly on housing because it is predominantly state and particularly local governments that control where housing gets built, what housing gets built, how much housing gets built. And so the federal government doesn't have a lot of levers, even though it is, as we've sort of discussed at the front, going to be one of the most important political issues. And so you can see that in, the way that they're attacking these problems. It's coming through helping alleviate deposit constraints by, things like first home loan deposit scheme, which is not called that anymore. What's it called now, Ben?
Home guarantee schemes.
The way that they're tackling that is, through things like trying to alleviate deposit constraints through things like the home guarantee scheme or, being able to access your super, or trying to help on the supply side by tackling infrastructure and kind of the things that enable housing, but not actually necessarily housing itself. And so I think that really highlights, to get to your point, Alice, the need for kind of this targeted and joint approach between local, state and federal governments, because one of them can't solve it by themselves, that there is going to be that interlink between them.
With all these announcements and different levels of government working together, I think it's all very nice. And, if parties say we're going to commit to X, Y, and Z. But Angus, realistically, when can we actually expect these commitments to become tangible and actually see some results?
From a political perspective, I'd have to handball that or maybe hospital pass that one to Ben, because I'm not a political commentator. If we see this stuff come through, how long is that going to take to matter? On the supply side, it is unfortunately quite a long time. We talk about how many homes we're building and the gap between what we're currently doing and, even the National Cabinet target. Even that is, sort of 60, 70,000 homes a year, which is fairly small in the context of the total number of houses in Australia. Sort of, while that will help, and it is the only thing that's going to matter in the long run, it is in the long run that it's going to matter. It's not going to help in the next sort of 1, 2, 3 years.
One thing I do want to touch on, even though it's actually not a federal issue and it is a state issue, it's stamp duty, and it would be remiss if I didn't mention it. Angus, why do you actually think this issue is so critical?
Why do I want to talk about stamp duty? Because it's kind of the most important tax setting in housing policy that we can change and that would have a big impact. It is, in a sense, quite low-hanging fruit in that way. And the reason for this is just that stamp duty today is so much more expensive than it used to be. To kind of put it in a little bit of context, the cost of stamp duty on a typical house relative to income, so kind of, trying to compare like for like, for a home buyer today versus one a generation ago, is something like 4.5 to 6 times as expensive as it used to be, which is a huge increase. You're talking about potentially $100,000 or more in New South Wales and Victoria.
Their stamp duty is also upfront money. Like, it's
Exactly
not money that gets added on to the life of your loan that you can pay off each fortnight or each month, however you structure your mortgage repayments. It's money that you pay the minute you sign on that dotted line.
Particularly for first home buyers that are deposit constrained, a real problem and a really big hurdle to have to get over. The other impact that it has is it discourages people from moving. Because it's really expensive to move, people don't do so. And so what we end up having is people in homes that are too small or too big or not close enough to their jobs that they wouldn't choose if it wasn't so expensive to move. And that means that we're just not using the housing we do have. We've been talking about how we build more housing, but we can also make better use of the housing that we do have. And stamp duty stops us from doing that. So in my mind, it is a really key issue. Now, it's not a federal government issue. It's a state government issue. It's a state government tax. But there is an important role for the federal government in helping states reform it because it's such a big part of state government revenue. Just trying to get rid of it as a state would be prohibitively costly. So there's a role for the federal government to help kind of manage that transition for them.
Do you reckon we're going to see business as usual, people buying and selling like normal, or do you think that the election just might stagnate things a little bit and people might just hold off?
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but we know that there's been past research that has shown that the buying and selling activity, there is a bit of a slowdown in the lead up to an election. And that makes sense. If you're a buyer and someone's telling you that you might be able to access your super or you might be able to access your other scheme, you might want to rethink about sort of what you want to buy or where you want to buy. So those sort of reactions, I think, make sense. People will probably, wait a little longer just to see what the result is.
Is there anything from an economical point of view that you think we haven't covered in this episode that is going to be impacted by the election?
I think the key thing for me, and I harp on this constantly, is just the need for building more homes, that being the focus. It's pleasing that we are seeing governments focus on that. I think we could do more. I hope that we will do more, but it is pleasing that has at least been more of the discussion than has been the case in the last 20 years or so.
And Ben, what about you? Is there any kind of big policy proposal or something that you think we need to talk about?
Yeah, I just make a quick observation around the way that state governments and the federal government seem to be working more hand in hand nowadays. They're working at the national cabinet level, which is really interesting. And, there's a lot of discussion in the media around the fact that that there is more dialogue between these governments now. And it feels like things are heading in the right direction. It's definitely got a long way to go for sure. But there is a bit of a feeling that, at least there's more dialogue happening around housing now. And it's, a bigger priority than ever, really.
Well, look, thank you so much to both of you for coming on. And I really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. This has been Real Talk. For your weekly fix, please follow wherever you listen to your podcasts and tune in next time for more real questions, news and insights on the topics that matter most from realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. All information provided is general advice and opinion based on current market conditions. These opinions should not be treated as investment advice. Always obtain advice based on your individual circumstances.
Real Talk acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, air and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present.